Tunisian migrations and so on. And then I saw some photographs of the royal family of Hue, the cultural center of Vietnam. And the dress style of the ladies was almost entirely consistent with Peranakan style. So that raises a question. Were the Peranakans there? Or what is the history of the Peranakans? And then the problem now is that, okay, I've just finished reading Nomad by Ayan Rashid Ali, who makes a very serious claim, accusation, that Islam itself is totally unsympathetic to multiculturalism, and in fact is anti-modern. Therefore cannot, in her view, be admitted into the community of nations. And in fact, Islam rejects the community of nations, and that it is beholden on every Muslim, in fact, to have a global jihad. How would these kinds of themes figure in history that one might want to consider?
Okay, addressing the first. When we visit the ethnographic museums in Southeast Asia, particularly the ones I am familiar with the ethnographic museum in Hanoi, which happens to be, on the one hand, a very good one, and on the other hand, I think a very problematic one. My worry with the way that all these histories are written, and I think museums, especially when they are official state museums, still, no matter what, remain within the logic of governmentality. And that's why I always find visits to these sort of state-sponsored ethnographic museums very difficult to deal with. And with that, I will also include the Peranakan museums that we have here in Singapore and also in Malaysia. There's a Peranakan museum in Malacca, as you know, and there's one in Penang, I think is under construction. I worry about museums because I share Ben Anderson's concern that basically the museum plays this role of, again, freezing time. And what these museums do is they freeze, certain identities and give them neatly sutured, contours and frontiers, which I find very problematic. I'm certainly not, at least in the work that I try to do when writing about Malaysia and Indonesia, is I'm not trying to say that subaltern history is simply a case of replacing one official history with another. I definitely do not believe that, for example, the history of women is more valid or real than the history of men. It's not a straightforward reversal of the dichotomies, or that the history of persecuted minorities is somehow more authentic than the dominant majority. That's not the case. What I'm calling for basically is a sort of reconciliation or a dialogue between histories, between narratives. We tend to think of history with a capital H as if it's one totalized discourse. And yet we forget that throughout Southeast Asia, all these communities actually have multiple histories that overlap, interact, and dialogue with each other. Dialogue, however, like I said, will not bring us to some happy land. It doesn't necessarily mean we leave the dialogue happier, but at least we have managed to actually make our claims vis-a-vis each other. Because I believe that histories are written intertextually. They are actually written in relation to each other. Let me pose this question to you then. Can we in Southeast Asia have a common history of Southeast Asia? Whether it's a common history of Southeast Asia as configured according to the logic of nation states, or can we have a common history of Southeast Asia that bypasses the logic of the nation states? Either way, we're still going to be faced with a problem. Let's take the first case. If you're going to have, let's say, ASEAN has a project, let's write a common history book for all schools of Southeast Asia. How do you then reconcile the history of Indonesia and East Timor? Who's going to write that? Who's going to write that? How are we going to write, because East Timor has now stepped onto the stage of world nations as the youngest nation in the world. It is already in the process of writing its history. Yeah? It's already in the process of writing its history. But how can you have a combined syllabus, say, theoretically, a history book that combines the history of Indonesia and East Timor sitting side by side? It can only be a contested history, but why not? Why do we assume that history has to have this pacifying role to make us happy? Histories can actually contradict. And in the process of doing so, of course, histories have to be revised and rewritten. I happen to think that Indonesia, among the states of Southeast Asia, I happen to think that Indonesia is probably the state that has achieved the most. It's an amazing project. It's a country the size size of Europe with 14,000 islands. The fact that it emerged at all is almost a miracle, although I don't believe in miracles. But Indonesia is a truly amazing nation state. But reading the history of Indonesia vis-a-vis the history of East Timor scars the history of Indonesia permanently, and rightly so. Because while we can claim, well, I can claim that Indonesia is a country that has done great things, it is also a country that has done terrible things. And like it or not, that has to be inscribed in the history of Indonesia. Now, the problem that we have, especially those who write official history, I think the problem arises because there's always a tendency to iron out history as if it's a neat fabric that can't have these nasty bumps and stains on it. But history is about recording. The job of the historian is simply to record the progression of events as factually and correctly as possible. And this includes writing the history of scarred bodies and scarred nations. Indonesia is a scarred nation. Every nation in Southeast Asia is a scarred nation. We've all gone through moments of terrible trauma. Let's remind ourselves that Southeast Asia is the second most violent part of the world historically. Here is where you had the 1965 anti-communist push in Indonesia. Here is where you had the Vietnam War. Here is where you had the Khmer Rouge. Here is where you had the genocide against the students in Thailand in 1976. In Malaysia, you had the emergency, and you have May 69. All these things are part and parcel of the national narrative, and they have to be recorded in there. It leaves us with a problematic, painful history, but I would argue that history is a discourse for adults. We are not writing fairy tales. And that's why to write the history of Southeast Asia is an adult process that has to be written by adults and read by adults. Not to write happy stories so that we have another ASEAN convention and we take up all our ethnic dress and for 2 hours we replay our exoticism vis-a-vis each other. So, if it's in Manila, we all start wearing, what do they call those white shirts that are there? Barong shirts, or if it's in Jakarta, we all wear batik like Obama, for two hours, and we can't continue to have this, reenactment of, like I said, staged exoticism, and call this our history. Our history is complex, and it includes many other aspects of our marginalized history that don't come into official histories at all, including gendered histories. One thing that has not been written about, not only women's history, but gendered history. Gendered history is almost an unresearched subject in Southeast Asia, and I think that's what I'm trying to go for. Now, as for Hershey Ali's comments about Islam and all that, well, again, I tend to be a bit blasé and all this, and I've been too close to fanatics for the last 10 years to even get affected by what they say. There's no denying that the politicization of religion is dangerous. I study the same when I'm in India, and I look at the rise of extreme Hindu right-wing politics. It's the same anywhere. Like I said, what interests me about the mindset of the local, homegrown, jihadis that we have in Southeast Asia is that they seem to be curiously blind to nation-state boundaries. I find that fascinating. And it's also interesting because I see it as a living present-day phenomenon. I mean, jihadis travel with Air Asia, this is the amazing thing. I mean, they're using modern modes of logistics and communication to basically travel around Southeast Asia and claim Southeast Asia. I don't agree, obviously, with what they're trying to do. But nonetheless, like I said, what is important for me, what is interesting, is to understand this mindset of a people who do not actually see the nation-state as the prime actor in their lives. Now that, like I said, is actually taking place. Smugglers are doing it, illegal immigrants are doing it, and there's massive illegal immigration, by the way, in Southeast Asia. It's taking place all the time. I mean, we are concerned about it in Malaysia and Singapore because we see poorer Southeast Asians coming to us. But even among the quote-unquote poorer Southeast Asian countries, there is non-recorded extra-legal movement taking place all the time. And we just don't record this. And I think there, perhaps, if you were to record that, would be a recording of the history of Southeast Asia. Because when we look back to our ancient past, the monuments in Cambodia today, for example, Angkor, one of whose builders was Surya Varman, it is said that Surya Varman actually came from what is now Patani and Kelantan. Now, that's interesting. To actually note the history, the long history of movement and migration, especially migration of labor in Southeast Asia, I think is something that deserves to be done. It doesn't necessarily make us happy, like I said, and I don't turn to history to make me happy. If I want to be happy, I go to the cinema.
Okay, my question is, do you see any problems with the Singapore story?
Which Singapore story are you talking about? Is it Mr. Raffles?
The official one.
The official one?
Yes.
No, official stories for me